Hey friends out there in YouTube land, Robert Ham here with Robert Ham Photography. You know me, guys. Today I'm here to talk to you about how to use a light meter. How cool is that? Something just as simple as a light meter. But before we get started, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to remind you to like and subscribe. If you like this type of content, if you enjoy my videos, if you follow what I'm doing, if you're watching this, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. It helps me out quite a bit. If you don't like it, hit the thumbs down button twice and tell me why. Otherwise, you'll get a mad little comment in the comment section, and then I'll never know who you were. So, yeah, take that to the grave and chew on it. Anyways, the other thing I wanted to let you know, if you don't realize that I'm actually building a camera right now and have a film-tested working module right here of a traditional box camera, then that's my fault. I haven't done a good enough job sharing that with everyone. I have, in my hands, you're looking at a working prototype of the ham camera. This is what we're calling the hashtag ham cam. The nomenclature will actually be unveiled with the Kickstarter that's coming out this October. How cool is that? And modularity means all kinds of things, from your own removable shutter blocks, face plates, to your own cartridge designs and different things like that. And swappable, think about that, swappable interchangeable lenses. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of it because I want to get into the metering section, but this is real. It's coming to you fall 2017. Guys, you know I like the TL70. My favorite Instax camera, definitely. My favorite Instax mini camera. It's probably my favorite of all time, even of cameras that are out there, even with the new Square by Lumography and everything. This thing is awesome. I just love it. I love its design. I love its feeling. I like how it works. I love the photos. And I get some amazing photos. People are always telling me and asking the question on Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else, "Hey Rob, how do you get such great photos? Hey Rob, how does your saturation look so nice? Hey Rob, do you edit your photos before you post them?" And sometimes I do. Sometimes I do edit just a little bit in order to make the photo representative of what I actually took on the image, meaning that what I upload looks like this. And you guys know many things can affect that, such as lighting conditions, or having to take a picture of a picture. But if you came and saw my wall, these things look beautiful in person. In fact, they look better in person than they do online. So the question is, how do I get it? I'm here to tell you I've got a video on all of that with over 50, I think we're up to 60 videos on the TL70 now. But I'm going to share with you something that's very important. You see, and that is I realized that the TL70 is a professional grade aperture priority camera with exposure compensation. It's got a 3-element aspherical lens and it produces crazy bokeh, okay, at f/5.6. Anecdotal evidence for me, I'm going to just share this little chestnut with you. I like f/8. And I can make f/8 work in pretty much every environment with or without a neutral density filter. And that's really cool because it allows me to get out and go. f/8's got a lot of really cool depth of field that it can show, nice and shallow. I can get some separation and some background blur. And it also is just my favorite spot for the lens. I think it's the best all around. Although f/5.6 works amazing and just blasts out everything as far as bokeh is concerned. But how do I do it? That's why you're here. And I do it with a light meter app. And actually, I post the pictures of it. And I know that you guys are seeing it because I get questions about it. This particular light meter app is by a gentleman by the name of David Quayle, or Quayles. I'm sorry if I butcher your name and you watch this, David. But he produces this app. You can get it for iOS and Android. This is what you see me using. And I've got the big version here on my iPad just so that you can see. I want to share some information with you. Before we get into anything, I'm just going to hit the measure button so that we can get what says an EV. And this says, right now, is saying EV5, an exposure value of 5. And that's very important. Remember, light is rated in exposure values, where each exposure value is twice as much light as the one before, and half as much light as the one before that one. So an exposure value of 5 is twice as bright as 4, but only half as bright as 6. Very similar to the way film speeds were put together. Like 100 is twice as sensitive to light as 50, but only half as sensitive to light as 200. If these concepts are new to you, and this sounds a little crazy and you're not used to it, that's totally okay. We were all there. I was there a long time ago. I learned it all, then I forgot it all shooting digital, then I remembered it again shooting digital and got better, and it goes back and forth. What I'm here to tell you is it's not like a bicycle. If you don't use it, you can lose it. You'll remember some of it, so don't feel bad. It's totally cool to reach out and get some questions answered by myself or other great artists out there that are producing cool work with this camera. I'm going to give you another little nugget, a little chestnut. The photography community in the United States is crap. I don't like it at all. I like the community out and overseas. I talk to most of the people that are photographers that I know are overseas. You guys, I don't know what's the difference, but you guys are awesome. I love conversating with you. I love the conversation we have. I love the support. Over here, if you go to a photo show or something like that, people are going to be comparing their photos to yours. I'm better than you, everything else. I tell those guys to go fly kites. I don't even get down with it. So here's the deal. If you find someone that's telling you there's only one way to do something, they're probably telling you the wrong way. Just like me, when I'm sharing this with you, I encourage you to go out, try it, and then share what works back with me. I need your feedback too, in order to make sure that my information stays relevant. And this question I'm answering is actually question number 2 for Antonella, a wonderful lady over in Italy who's been asking some questions about how to use flash, macro, light meter, all that stuff. And you see, it's that type of communication which helps us all. Now, I'm off my soapbox. You heard my position. Let's get into it. That little EV that we saw when it read an EV of 5 is telling us that there are 5 levels of exposure brightness in this room. It's at a level 5, which is very dark. Remember, outdoors in a bright sunny day at the park, you're at a level 15, an EV 15, an EV 16. If you're around water, like at the beach and there's the waves out there, you're probably around an EV 16 or 17. And these are things you can just put in your mind and know. Now, the reason that's important is because the exposure value equates to a set of variables in your aperture, your film speed, and your shutter speed selection. We're not going to go into all that today because we don't have the ability to select much with the TL70. The aperture is what we can select directly, and we can then select exposure compensation plus or minus 1 stop, but we can't directly change the shutter speed plus or minus whatever we want. It's only 1 stop based off of what the camera meters. We'll get into that in a second. And the other thing that we can't change is the film. It's ISO 800, so we can't change that. So right now, although these concepts would work applying to any camera, I'm going to talk specifically with the TL70. And the last thing to know about this whole system that we're using, the TL70 and the film and that gorgeous lens, is that the film itself, FUJIFILM Instax Mini Film, is a very contrasty, daylight balanced film. And what that means is that it has a narrow exposure range. In my own testing, FUJIFILM didn't put this information out. They put 8 documents out about Instax Mini, but they didn't put out, you can even know its lines of resolution, and that's fine. 12 lines of resolution per millimeter of the film. That's actually pretty high for the size and the format. But they don't tell us how many exposure values or what the dynamic range of the medium is. And they don't tell us what the exposure range of the medium is. And those two are mutually exclusive because the film is both the medium that is the image is taken on and the medium that it is viewed on. That's where exposure range and dynamic range differ. One is what has the ability to take and show an image through a development. The other one has the ability to print and reproduce an image for viewing. 2 separate things. However, all of that aside, we're talking about the TL70 using Instax Mini Film. ISO 800 speed film is 8 times faster, brighter, more sensitive to light than what I would normally use when going outside and shooting with any one of my Olympus rangefinders, which I love so much. Normally, I'd use ISO 100 speed film to shoot outside during the day in sunny 16 conditions. The same conditions you would want to use the TL70. However, Instax Mini Film only comes in 1 speed rating, that's 800. So let's talk about that now. Because it's such a fast speed, the only thing that we can do in order to get a good exposure is understand what the Sunny 16 rule says. And let's talk through it real quick for 1 second. The Sunny 16 rule says that on a bright day with defined shadows, where the sun is warm, you feel warm and there's no cloud cover and your shadows have a hard defined line, that if you use an aperture of 16 and then you set your film speed to the same number as your shutter speed, or that's actually backwards, set your shutter speed to the same number as your film speed, then you will be assured a good, proper exposure. And this is, of course, works out because of math, and that's all I'm going to say about that right now. So here's the deal. With the ISO 800 speed film, we have to do some additional math. We have to open up and close down. So because we don't have, if we use 800 speed film, we don't have 1/800th of a second on the camera itself. we have 1/500th of a second. So in order to close down and move from 800 up, one stop more from 800, down would be 1/400th of a second, and one stop up from 600 or 16 would be f22, an aperture of 22. So the camera, when it walks outside with you and it starts to meter a bright scene, wants to be on f22. That's what we should be choosing, and then it's probably going to choose 1/400th or 1/500th of a second based on the setting. Okay, and that's how we're going to get a good exposure with the 800 speed film. However, what we can be assured more of is if we meter. You see, that's just us guessing. And if we look down at that little green light, sometimes it's going to read shadows that we're not aware of because our eyes are so used to seeing so much more and understanding so much more dynamic range. So the first thing that we do when we turn the light meter app on, right, is we set it to R, which means reflexive index metering. That's the light that's on your subject that bounces back to the camera. The second thing we do is we set the ISO right here, which is what we're going to be using, which is 800 speed. And you can see you get a little preview window, and that's important because then we can just turn it, we can press the measure button, and it's going to tell us how bright that scene was, and it's going to give us a little picture. Now, it tells us that the scene is an EV of 8. That's good, because right now we know that Instax Mini Film has an EV of 10. So this 8 is less than 10, which means that if we do our job right, we should be able to get a perfect exposure because we are using fewer EV. We're not exhausting the dynamic range of the film or the exposure range of the film. Now, if we're outside on a bright sunny day and it says EV 15, that tells us that as an EV of 10, which is what the film, in my opinion, is actually able to produce, means that we're going to have to split the difference between some things being blown out and some things being crushed. So your white's being blown out and your dark's being crushed. If we don't do that, then we will just get a crazy exposure. We have to balance that. We have to manage that. The little green light inside the TL70 is actually metering the whole scene. So the reason an app like this is important is because when you look at the little green light, you don't know what it's choosing to meter off of because you can't see what it's actually metering. It may be metering off a shadow in front of you, and it may choose a very slow shutter speed in a bright condition that would actually blow out the film, and you'd never even know it. So here, that's the first thing. Now you might say, Rob, that's great. It helps us. How though? We can't set the shutter speed. All we can do is set the aperture, and I can't change this aperture ring on the outside. And I would say, great. We're not supposed to actually move this dial around. Once we hit measure, this dial that moves is telling us information. And it's telling us in this case, in this room, if we were using f5.6, it'd be at 1/8 of a second, basically. It's a little bit more. It's a third of a stop longer than 1/8, which would be right around 1/10, almost 1/10 of a second. Okay? If we were to use f8, it's saying we're almost using 1/4 of a second. More like 1/3 actually. And that's important because f8 is a smaller aperture than f5.6, so it's a darker aperture, so the shutter would need to stay open longer. And this is important because when we're out there looking at the scene on a bright sunny day at the beach, and we read this and it says something like, an EV of 17, and we look and it says f5.6 at 1/4000th of a second, we know that the camera can't use 1/4000th of a second because it doesn't have 1/4000th of a second. However, check this out. If we have a 3-stop neutral density filter, we can get to 1/500th of a second. If you were in a condition where it said f5.6 and then it showed 1/4000th of a second, putting a 3-stop neutral density filter would move that back into the camera's range at 1/500th of a second. And here's how. 4,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 1,000, 1,000 to 500. So those are the 3 stops that the neutral density filter would give you in this situation. And then you're going to say, Rob, how do we know the camera's going to choose 1/500th of a second? You got the 3 stops from 1/4000 with the 3-stop neutral density filter, but how do we know that it's going to choose 1/500th of a second? Well, we know it probably will because we're outside in a bright day and the camera has a matrix metering. So as long as we're not pointing at any shadows in front of us, and as long as our hand isn't cupping the electronic eye, providing a shadow over top of it, it's probably going to choose the fastest shutter speed that we've got, which is 1/500th of a second. And then you might say to me, well, Rob, how do we know for sure that it will? And I would say that's where your 1 stop of exposure compensation comes in. if you're outdoors on a bright sunny day and you want to make sure that the camera is using 1/500th of a second, such as this example, you would just go ahead and click that exposure compensation lever slider over to the negative. And now, whatever the camera is metering when it's reading that little green light, in fact, it's probably going to show you an orange light, it's going to make sure that you're using one stop faster. So if it did, for one instance, choose anything down as low as 1/250th of a second, one stop faster with that negative exposure compensation is 1/500th. So we're basically guaranteeing that the camera will use 1/500th of a second. That's how we use this thing. We've given you a couple of examples right there. Let's talk about one more example just to make sure that it makes sense. In this situation where it's showing that we have an EV of 8 at or an EV of 8 at f5.6, that is 1/8 of an eighth of a second, right? And so basically what that means is that the camera can actually take this image all on its own self just by pressing the button when in auto mode. But let's say we wanted to take something at f11 for whatever reason. f11 says, man, we need 2 seconds. Or actually f22 would say 2 seconds. If we decided to use f22, we would actually need to have a 2-second exposure. The automatic mode on the camera does 1 second all the way up to 1/500th of a second. If you want a 2-second exposure, you have to switch it to bulb mode, and then you have to push it, the shutter button, and then let go of the shutter button when you think 2 seconds have passed. You can just count that in your head. Okay, so once again, here's what's happening. We've got a light meter app. This is the same app that I show you on my pictures over on Instagram. When I want to take a photo and I'm in an unusual environment, because I'm pretty good with outdoors and reading the light at the beach and everything. If I'm in a shady environment, I know f8 is pretty good. What I'll do is pick this up. I'll set my ISO to 800 to match the film speed, and I'll click measure. And then I'll look at what it gives me, and it's going to give me a range. And it's going to tell me f5.6, f8, f16, and f22. Those are the 4 apertures that I can touch and change on the TL70. And I'm going to look and see what it says for each one. And then I'm going to use my experience. If it says that it can get f5.6 in the shade of the trees at 1/30th of a second, I'm going to look and say to myself, I know that the TL70 meters for the shadows because of the type of meter that's in there. If I use f5.6, it's probably going to overexpose. It's probably going to use a very long shutter at f5.6. So what I would then do is use negative exposure compensation in order to make sure that it would use a faster shutter. In fact, most of the time outdoors during the day, I use a wide aperture and negative exposure compensation. That's a pro tip. Use it wisely. Also, at nighttime, I use a wide aperture and positive exposure compensation. That's a pro tip as well. So when it starts to get a little bit darker, golden hour starts coming out, I start using positive exposure compensation. When it's bright, I use negative exposure compensation like at the beach. And in the middle, like when my porridge is not too hot or too cold, it's in the middle, I just use the middle slider and I get great results. But I'm always using this. Guys, I'm Robert Ham with Robert Ham Photography. I hope that this has been helpful. This little primer on how to use a light meter. This has been specific to the awesome TL70. I hope you've had as much fun with this as I have. I'm Robert Ham. I want to thank you for watching and remind you that I will catch you on the flip side.